Um, right now, I am very excited to introduce our next speakers, Marley Blonsky and Kaylee Kornhauser. You might recognize them from the All Bodies on Bikes video that came out earlier this year, but they've been advocating for more inclusive bicycling communities for several years now, and they do such an amazing work. So I'm very excited that they'll be joining us today for this workshop. So with that, Marley and Kaylee, take it away.
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm going to share my screen. All right. Can folks see that now? All right. Great. Thank you so much for having us today. I'm Kaylee. Marley, do you want to say?
Sure. And I'm Marley, and we do have an introduction slide that tells you a little bit more about who we are in the slides. So let's jump into it. So before we, go ahead.
No, before we get started, and it sounds like folks have already maybe done this today, we like to start with a land acknowledgement. We'll both do our land acknowledgements as we introduce ourselves, but if you are unsure whose traditional land you occupy, you can find more at that link, and we're happy to post in the chat if need be. So I'm Kaylee Kornhauser. I use she, her pronouns, and I am on the traditional lands of the Kalapuya people here in Corvallis, Oregon, where I'm a full-time PhD student at Oregon State University. But I also spend a lot of time doing stuff like this. I love to bike, all types of biking. In this picture, I'm mountain biking, but I think I like bike packing probably the most, or biking to get donuts or something, and love doing work like this, trying to make the bike community a more inclusive space for people in larger bodies.
And hello, I'm Marley Blonsky. I am coming to you from the lands of the Duwamish people in Seattle, up in the Northwest. I also use she, her pronouns, and similar to Kaylee, I do all sorts of kinds of biking, bike packing, commuting, although I hope I'm never going back to the office ever again. We'll see about that. Riding bikes with friends, community rides, kids, all sorts of things. Right now, I work full-time for a logistics company doing sustainability work, but I'm actively trying to transition out of that and into the bike world. So I'll just kind of throw this out there. If anybody is hiring, let me know. Cool. Let's go to the next slide. So as we go through this presentation, we obviously creating size positive or fat positive communities is a very broad topic. So Kaylee and I have kind of narrowed it down to what we think is the most important and or relevant, but obviously more things are going to come up. So this is kind of what we're going to talk about, but feel free to raise other topics in the chat. So we're going to kind of talk about the background, how we got into it. We'll talk about community building. I think what we're all here for. We'll talk some practical concerns like clothing and equipment, because when you live in a larger body, you can't just hop on any old bike, unfortunately, or walk into any store and get clothing that works for you. Maybe one day, which is why we do this work. Anyway, we'll spend a little bit of time on marketing. We don't have a ton of time, and then we'll get into discussion and Q&A.
This is a good place to mention, we love taking questions or reading people's comments in the chat, or if you want to hop off of mute at any point. So please, if things come to mind or things aren't clear, just put it in the chat. We've got the chat up, so we'll try to answer as we go. Great, so we wanted to start with some background, and we're just going to jump into some ground rules that we have that we try to follow when we talk about body size inclusion, and we'll get into some of the kind of foundational knowledge that helps us create inclusive spaces.
Okay, so these ground rules, they're similar to the community agreements we just talked about, but they are a little bit more specific to talking about body size. This is often a conversation that most of us don't have. Maybe we have it in the privacy of our therapist's office, or maybe with some friends, but it's not often in large groups like this. So we try and create as comfortable as a space as possible. And we would welcome additional suggestions for this conversation we're about to have. So the first one is fat is not a bad word. Kaylee and I use it to describe ourselves. We will go into the nuances of this in a little bit, but in general, we use it as just a neutral descriptor. Same thing as I would say, oh, I've got purplish blue hair. I'm a fat person, just no big deal. So.
Yeah, in this discussion, we'll stay away from diet talk, and I encourage you to try and use some of these rules in your daily life. We don't know who we're around and how they might be affected by things like talking about restricted eating. So in this conversation, we won't talk about that, and maybe you'll carry that into your daily practice.
The third one is please don't body shame either yourself or others. I would also encourage you to take that into your daily life as well. I know it can be hard, but sometimes when you start changing those internal narratives, you might be surprised at the thoughts that go through your head, and just encourage you to think about that.
Yeah, our fourth ground rule, it's a little bit less obvious, to beware of coded language, or you might say beware of microaggressions. A quick example is if you see a person in a larger body post a swimsuit photo online, and then people say, wow, you're so confident. It sounds like a compliment, but what are you saying in that compliment? That maybe if you looked like that, you wouldn't wear that outfit, or that you're surprised that person feels confident in the body that they're in. And so this is a good place to remind ourselves and everyone else that this is a learning environment. We're gonna make mistakes. If this is the first time you're talking about this topic, or one of the first, obviously we're not gonna do it perfectly. So we're all here to learn together. It's perfectly fine to mess up or ask questions that you're worried about. But these are just guiding principles, really.
The next one is similar to what Kaylee just talked about, trust intent and acknowledge impact. So you might have the best intentions in the world when you're saying something, but the way that it comes across might be harmful. And so it's important to acknowledge that sometimes, even with good intentions, what we say or do can be harmful, and to own up to that. But that we're also all here to learn together. We're not here to create harm or do harm to anybody else, hopefully.
And our last ground rule is to celebrate our bodies for what they can do. And I think if you've seen our film, I hope that's kind of central, this idea of joyful movement, moving in a way that feels good to us, whatever that means. So we've got, just a few pieces of terminology we want to go over, and then we'll kind of get into some less like rules. Do you want to start with the first one, Marley?
Sure. So you heard Kaylee and I you heard me refer to me and Kaylee as fat, but that's not necessarily something that I would, how do I want to say this? Kaylee, I feel like you explained this well. It's a term that we have used for ourselves. When we refer to other people, we talk about bigger people, or people in larger bodies. I'm not going to call somebody who has not acknowledged for themselves that they are a larger person. I'm not going to call them fat. It can be a very polarizing term. And so these are the terms that we choose to use, is either bigger people or people in larger bodies. And just encourage you to do the same. If somebody calls themselves fat and is okay with you saying that as well, then it's probably fine. But this can be a safer word to use.
Yeah, and whenever Marley and I refer to groups of people, we always use the word bigger people, because we don't know how that group of people wants to be referred to unless they've invited us to use the term fat. The second piece of terminology is health or fitness. There's this idea of health at every size, and there's a sort of movement in the nutrition space to talk about health at every size. And it's really fantastic work. But I also am cautioning myself and trying to kind of push myself to think, we're trying to break down the barriers for people in larger bodies. And an easy way to do that is kind of, we slip into it, is to be like, well, just because I'm fat doesn't mean I'm unhealthy or not fit. But then we're using ableist terms to try to gain ourselves privilege sort of at the detriment of people with disabilities. So that's tricky in this space, right? Because we're talking about biking, we're talking about a physical activity that some people physically cannot do. So I don't have a hard and fast way to deal with this. I think it's messy. I think that this community of fat activists hasn't figured it out yet fully. But those terms, health and fitness, both are not tied to body size, and also people in the fat community are trying to kind of push themselves not to use those as ways to say, I'm still worthy of respect and value because I'm healthy or fit, because that's not great either. So anything to add on that one, Marley?
No, I think that's great. Yeah. The next one is obesity and overweight, and we try and stay away from these words. In kind of doing this research and becoming more learned in this area, I learned that obesity actually comes from the Latin word obesus, which means having eaten oneself fat, which is just like so gross and awful. And there's so many reasons besides eating that somebody is in a larger body. And it's such a pathologized, medicalized term. I think technically I've been obese since I was like 5, because of the stupid scale that our modern medical system uses. So we would just encourage folks to stay away from that word. Same with overweight or underweight, because that really implies that there is one ideal weight to be at. And there's so much variability within humans that it's very, very limiting to look at things in just in terms of you know, ideal weight. So we'd ask that we stay away from those terms.
Great. And we already mentioned the term joyful movement and talked a little bit about what it is, but there's, you know, a whole group of people who teach about different types of eating and movement. And one of those approaches is joyful movement that I know has changed the way I've looked at biking. We'll talk more about that later, but really just about doing the activity in a way that feels good. And that's something, no matter what size body you're in, that you could try to use in your approach to cycling. And it's changed how I bike for the better.
Me too. Cool. So kind of another foundational topic, and one that Kaylee and I are keenly aware of, especially as it relates to privilege, is the idea of a fat spectrum. So similar to other things in life, you know, sexuality, color, etc. This all exists in a spectrum. And Kaylee and I are what are called small to mid fats. So we're bigger, and we have fat in our body. Well, I don't know what I'm saying right now. Anyway, we're small fats, small to mid fats. But what that really means is it affords us a lot of privilege that folks in bodies larger than us don't have. So I would just encourage you, as we go through this conversation, to think about how you could be an advocate for people who might be larger. Because, you know, Kaylee and I can, for the most part, get cycling clothing. We can get on most bicycles. But as we get up into, you know, the super fat or the infinifat folks, the options are much more limited, and they face a lot more discrimination, either from like the healthcare system or just all sorts of places. So we just want to be very mindful of our place in this. Here's some fun photos of different friends that we've made throughout the years who fall along the fat spectrum. So up here on the left, I'm totally blanking on her name right now, but she was hiking Mount Kilimanjaro. There's actually a really cool documentary, I can put it into the chat, coming out soon about these women who hiked Mount Kilimanjaro. This woman on the top right is a triathlete and super, super awesome. Down here on the left, this is a guy from Sweden named Ebby, who is kind of building a European community called XL Biking, supporting larger riders in Europe primarily. And then on the bottom right is a person named Sam, who does a lot of backpacking and mountaineering and really advancing technical gear in the outdoor world for people in larger bodies. Because as you can imagine, if you're doing ice climbing or whatever it is she's doing here, I don't know, because I don't do winter, you would need technical clothing that fits. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit as well, because it's a safety issue.
Great. And this is our kind of last like background slide, and then we'll get into more bike specific things, which I'm sure is of interest to everybody here. But we did want to mention, you know, the difference between internal and external work. There's been a lot of focus lately on the body positivity movement, which is awesome. It's, you know, we all kind of probably know about it, really about accepting ourselves, loving our bodies, or body neutrality, feeling neutral about our bodies. And there's been social media campaigns, and a lot of businesses have picked it up as a part of their marketing strategy. And it's all great work, and work that Marley and I have done ourselves. But the point we want to make here is that no matter how much a fat person loves themselves, that doesn't get rid of the structural and institutional barriers that they'll face. And so this is just kind of the fact of the matter. So I view it as two different types of work. The body positivity movement is the internal work, and then the fat acceptance movement, it's sometimes called, is really a movement to address the structural barriers. And we'll talk later about why that's really important in bicycling. We can do a lot of cultural work, but there's still physical limitations for people in larger bodies that have to be addressed to make this size inclusive. So some examples, you know, you see on the slide: workplace discrimination, barriers to healthcare, and physical barriers. And some of these stats, all of them come from the National Association to Advance Fat Acceptance, which I really encourage you to look at if you're interested in learning more on these topics. But they report that fat people earn up to 6% less than thin people in comparable positions. 69% of fat people report being stigmatized by their doctors. Many people report not seeking care or extreme delay in care, incorrect diagnosis. And then physical barriers, if we think about things like how fat people navigate spaces, restaurants, classrooms. I know I've had the experience of not being able to fit in a desk. I'm typing in, sorry. Okay, I'll do that in a second. Can't talk and type, I guess. So similarly to, you know, the institutional and structural barriers that racial groups face, that people in different gender groups face, this is a problem that people can't just fix by loving themselves. And so that's really the point here. And I know we can all imagine the intersections between race and body size. Obviously, Marley and I are two white women, middle-class white women. So again, we have a lot of privilege in the space, being smaller fat people, being white, cisgendered. So these things become even more prevalent when we add in additional factors. Whoops, there we go.
Okay, so we're gonna switch gears here, but please do feel free, if as you're thinking about it and digesting all that information, to put things into the chat. Kaylee will add in the name of that resource there, and at some point I will add in the name of the documentary. But we're gonna switch over to talking about community building, and how we can all play an active role in building more inclusive communities, specifically for people in larger bodies. Let's go ahead and switch slides.
Oops. My water.
Sorry, tricked you.
Sorry about
that. So kind of starting out with a bang, these are my like top 5 tips to make your ride more inclusive. I've led hundreds of group bike rides, and I've also attended many group bike rides. Some are great, some are awful, but I get the same anxious butterflies before every one of, you know, am I going to be left behind? Am I going to be included? You know, where are we going? That sort of thing. So if I could just make this appeal to every single person who leads a group ride, my life's work would be complete, I think. So I think the first one is to be honest about what pace you're going and stick to it. So, you know, whether it is 12 miles an hour or 20 miles an hour, be honest in your, like, I don't want to say advertising, but what you tell people, and stick to it. Even if when you get there, you say, hey, we're going to do a 12 mile per hour, relatively low key ride. You get there and everybody's looking relatively fit. You don't know what's going on with them. And it's not fair to the people who showed up to then change it on them and say, okay, you all look like you are in great shape. We're going to change this up to 15 miles an hour. Like, don't do it. If you said you're doing 12 miles an hour, stick to it. That's my 2 cents on that. The next one is to publish your intended route before the ride. Obviously, there are exceptions to this where, part of the appeal of the ride is to not know where you're going and it's a mystery. Obviously, that's an exception. But I think for a lot of folks, knowing where the route is going, and if they need to like prepare mentally for a big hill climb or, plan for later activities, knowing exactly where the route is going can help allay a lot of those fears. And I didn't realize this for myself until I'd been group riding for a long time. And I was attending this group ride every week that I didn't know if I was going to end up 20 miles from home or 2 miles from home. And that was a huge source of anxiety for me. And once I identified that, I was like, oh, I just want to know where we're going. Like, you don't have to tell me everything, but just tell me. This next one I love. Have a sweeper who knows the route and destination. So that is somebody or a couple folks who are intended to stay at the back. I like to introduce them at the beginning of the ride and say, hey, I'm Marley. I'm going to be at the back of the ride. I will stay back there. That way, if we get split up or somebody gets a flat tire or whatever happens, I'll help get everyone to the end of the ride. And that could just help, if there's a wide variety of paces within the group, help make everybody feel comfortable. Or if somebody is not quite as comfortable sticking with the group and wants to hang 20 feet behind the main group, no big deal. Really, really love that one. This next one is to regroup at the top of hills and actually give people a chance to rest. So if you're at the front of the pack and you get to the top of the hill, it can be hard to know when the back of the group has gotten there. So just, practice your patience and just remember what it was like when you first started cycling and give people a chance to adequately rest at the top of hills. And it can really make the difference on somebody's ride from feeling included to feeling excluded. And then finally, this last one often brings up a lot of good conversation, is to drop judgment-based descriptions like beginner when you actually mean slow. Or if you're doing like an advanced ride, be prescriptive about the skills people need. So for example, if you're doing a mountain bike ride and people need to know how to navigate single track and go down like drops or stairs, like include that in your information. So that way people know exactly what to expect. This might be a pet peeve of mine just because I've been riding bikes for a very long time. And I don't like getting lumped in as a beginner, even though there's nothing wrong with being a beginner. But I just often like to ride at a slower pace. It's often a beginner pace. So really encourage folks to just use more accurate terms because somebody could have just picked up a bike yesterday and be super, super fast. So a beginner ride might not be appropriate for them. Any questions or comments on this? Okay, I'll keep checking the chat for it. But so kind of within the same vein, talking about actual in-person events, because we are getting to the point where we can do this again. So things to think about for making your events more size inclusive. And these can be bike related or not, thinking about weddings or conferences or whatever. Think about what chairs you have. As a fat person, chairs are like the worst thing in the world, especially like outdoor patio chairs or like flimsy chairs that they often have at weddings. I'm always afraid I'm going to break them, and it is so embarrassing. So if you have the ability to have any influence over the chairs that you have, encourage you to get either a variety of chairs, because I know like stronger chairs can cost different amounts of money, or chairs without arms. So just think about that. Encourage you to put different spacing between displays or larger spacing. So this is like if you're setting up a booth at a trade show, or if you work in a bike shop. Just spreading things out a little bit more. And this helps people who maybe have a disability or have a stroller. I don't know how many times I've knocked things over with my butt, not realizing that it was like so close behind me. And, you know, most of the time I can laugh it off, but sometimes it's embarrassing. So just encourage you to, you know, spread things out a little bit more. And if you really need that much stuff on the floor, like maybe rethink your retail display. I don't know. The next one is just thinking about who's in your marketing materials. And we'll talk about this a little bit later. But, you know, if you only show like skinny white folks, that's who I'm going to assume you want to attend your event. And other folks aren't going to feel included. I think Kaylee says as well that, you know, if when you're looking at a store, if you don't see somebody who's even plus size, you just assume you don't shop there. Right?
Yep.
Yeah.
What
was that?
I said, I don't even look.
Yeah, same. And then this next one, apparel sizing and swag giveaways. So if you are giving away some sort of like shirt or, you know, some sort of swag, maybe thinking about doing something that is size inclusive, or offering more sizes. You know, hats are size inclusive to most folks, and can work really well. All sorts of different options there. And then often with like shirt giveaways, they often are like whatever sizes are left over, which often doesn't feel good to folks who get left out. And then finally, if we've learned anything this year from COVID, is that virtual options work for a lot of people, you know, for whatever reason. Maybe you've got kids at home, maybe you've got a chronic illness, but if you're able to offer a like, what's the word? Double track, so live in person and live on the internet, just really encourage you to do that as well.
Lauren has made a great point in the chat. They say that, you know, slow, going back to the group ride slide, slow can have its own negative connotations, and being specific about miles per hour is more neutral. And I think something we forgot to say, or I just didn't hear it on that slide, is like saying slow in place of a mile per hour, or even saying like party pace or social pace. Like those words don't mean a lot, because my party pace or my social pace could be a whole heck of a lot different than yours. So being specific about miles per hour, I know it's tricky. It's tricky to stick to it when you're out there. It requires extra work, but it is so much more inclusive of so many more people, because, you know, if imagine being a new person and you don't even know what a social pace is. So you probably wouldn't want to go to a ride like that. So this is a good time to talk about some of the communities that have existed before the work that Marley and I started doing in the bike community. There are so many amazing organizations that are trying to create more inclusive spaces for people in larger bodies in all types of outdoor recreation. So maybe you've heard of Unlikely Hikers or Fat Girls Hiking. They're two organizations based out of the Pacific Northwest, but they have chapters all over the place, and they create spaces just for people in larger bodies. They create spaces for all body sizes. Really cool organizations. Encourage you to check them out. Climb Big does the same type of work, but in the rock climbing space. And then Body Positive Movement is BOPOMO, and that's size inclusive workout classes. So all of these organizations exist in all of these different spaces, trying to do the work that we're doing in biking elsewhere. And so it's amazing community, and we learn a lot from those existing communities. And if you're interested in other things like hiking or climbing, really check those out. So well, first off, I should say, if you're in a smaller body and you're here right now, thank you so much for coming to listen to a conversation about what it's like to be in a larger body, and trying to be better allies to folks in larger bodies. That it's amazing that people take time out of their day to learn how to make spaces more inclusive to people in larger bodies. A lot of this slide actually comes from things we've heard from people in smaller bodies about ways that they could help or be better allies. And one thing that's come up through Marley and I riding together and hearing from other folks is that, not all fat people are the same. We ride differently and we like being ridden with differently. I love when people ride with me, even if that means they've slowed down to do so. Hi. And maybe Marley doesn't prefer that. It's a good tip for anybody you're riding with is to ask how they'd prefer to be ridden with. So rather than assume that somebody wants you to ride with them a certain way, just ask. And it turns out that we all have different preferences. It can help a lot if people in larger bodies will speak up in group settings or call ahead to a bike shop, put themselves out there to say, hey, this group ride was marketed a certain way, now it's going much faster, or call a bike shop and say, do you have any bikes that have a weight limit of X amount? And that will help take some of the burden off of that person in a larger body who might be put into a kind of embarrassing or stressful situation. And then compliments, this one is a little fuzzy, but all the time when Marley and I are out biking, we get compliments like way to go or good work getting out here that our friends in smaller bodies don't get. And we'll be riding in the same groups and a person will pass me and they'll shout to me, good work, or you're almost there. And then they won't say anything to my friends in smaller bodies than me. And so we want to encourage folks to create a positive community out there. We're not trying to tell people don't say anything when you pass people. That's not ideal either. But think about what you're saying and how other people are receiving it. And using words like we've got this instead of you've got this is a great tiny adjustment that makes me feel a whole heck of a lot more included in the biking community than being called out or what assumptions is that person making about me when they say, way to get out there. And so just thinking, maybe just say, have a nice day or great day for a bike ride. Those are kind things we can say to each other when we're out on the road.
Before we move on, Kaylee, do you want to address can we address the question that I sent to you?
Yeah.
I don't know if you saw it.
Yeah, fitness challenges. And sorry, do you want to kind of summarize the question, Marley?
Yeah, so basically people, are super excited about either a fitness challenge that they're doing or a change in their diet that they've made and are really excited about it. Like, do we have recommendations on how to like either redirect that conversation or, if we're uncomfortable with that, like how to basically change the direction of the conversation. And this is honestly something that I struggle with, especially among my friend group who, I might not have like laid out these guidelines for. I'm like, how do I tell them I don't want to hear about their diet? Sometimes I just wear this, I have a shirt that says like IDGAF about your diet, Susan, which is probably a little passive aggressive. And I'm not recommending that. That's why I asked this to Kaylee, because Kaylee has more tact than I do.
That's not true. I think, if you're comfortable enough to say, hey, that's great. I'm happy for you. It sounds like you're really excited, but that's a topic that is challenging for me to talk about. I think that's the best way to set a boundary in any scenario. But I also think, the way I've been addressing it is like, for me, those fitness challenges or diets, like they were just not a positive way to approach biking, and they weren't a sustainable way for me to stay in biking and excited about it. And so I try to shift to be like, that's awesome. Like for me, I just have to ride like what feels good and eat what I want to, because that's like what gets me jazzed about cycling. So you could just like try to do a positive spin. It's hard though, because it's a sport. A lot of people approach it like a sport. I don't necessarily approach it like a sport, but there is space for people who want to approach, fitness challenges and people who just want to ride to the bakery and like that's all they ever want to do. And there's space for all of us. So does that help?
Yeah, I think so. And I think it's just a matter of practice of saying, hey, I don't actually want to have this conversation with you right now. Can we talk about something else?
Boundary setting is good.
Yep. So just a real quick time check, Kaylee, we've got probably about 20-ish minutes left, including Q&A.
Yeah, I'm gonna get us going through this. So clothing and equipment, practical stuff, people in larger bodies have to think about. So these slides are really for folks to screenshot if they're interested. These are brands that Marley and I have experience with. Every brand on this slide goes to a 3XL. And for reference, Marley and I wear 3XLs in the brands that are listed here. So 3XL is not a large enough size. And there's a whole debate about what makes size inclusive clothing brands. Yeah, Aerotech is pretty local, and Aerotech and our sports, which is this, can you see my cursor when I do that? This logo down here, triathlon brands, I guess Aerotech's kind of, our sports is a triathlon brand. It goes to 6XL. It's the most inclusive bike specific brand that we have found. And people in the triathlon world that, obviously are doing biking really seem to like this brand. So if you or someone is above a 3XL, probably people above a 3XL, this can be a good place to send them for padded bike shorts. And then I can just buzz through.
Go for it.
So these are some other brands that are not bike specific that do have extended sizing. They tend to go to 2 or 3XL, again, not large enough sizes. Superfit Hero is the one exception to that. They actually used to carry straight sizes as well as extended sizes. They stopped carrying straight sizes to focus on providing more extended sizes and now go to 7XL, I believe. And they have a really great website, encourage you to check out. So they've got kind of like workout clothes. So really, that's a really great option now for people in sizes above 3XL. And again, Marley and I shouldn't speak for Marley, but I am often unable to fit in a 3XL in the brands listed here. So even though I wear a 3XL in some brands, it doesn't always work.
All right, so as you start to think about clothing or bikes, there's other considerations as well. So specifically talking about bikes and components, there are structural weight limits. We don't necessarily have enough time to go into this, but Kaylee and I do teach another class called Biking for Big People, where we talk about how to find the structural weight limits, and it's often in the owner's manual, but how to make bikes stronger. So most bikes that come from like one of the big bike companies, Giant, Cannondale, etc., cap out around 275, 300 pounds, and that includes the rider and any cargo. So for the type of adventure cycling that Kaylee and I do, this can be really problematic because, I mean, I don't have a scale right now, but if I'm right around there, and then if I add any clothes or food, like I'm probably exceeding the weight limit of my bicycle, which can be a safety concern. So bike frames have structural weight limits, so do seat posts, so do wheels. There's also the physical considerations of larger bodies fit differently onto bicycles. So when you're working with a bike shop, making sure that they're sensitive to your needs and getting you fit properly onto a bicycle. Making sure that if you are experiencing any discomfort, you're taking care of that. So if you've got, I call it chub rub, but I think it's technically called like chafing or heat rash or whatever, taking care of that so it doesn't become infected. And there's lots of great products on the market out there for that. And then finally, components also can be problematic, isn't the right word, but they need to be paid attention to if you're in a larger body. So for example, we go through brake pads quicker because it's just physics. You've got more weight on your body. It takes more resistance to stop. it can be a really good idea to learn how to change your own brake pads. Otherwise, you might be in the bike shop all the time. Kaylee has a great story, and actually me too, being told, I think you're braking wrong because you need to replace your brake pads more often than other people. Like, that's not right. So just things to consider there. And actually, you've got some good advice about pedals. I don't know if you want to get into that or not.
Yeah, there's really two main types of pedals, and the type, if you're looking or going into the store, type with pins, they can be a little bit more expensive, but they last a lot longer than pedals with bearings. For people in larger bodies, you'll avoid getting those clicks or having your pedal unable to rotate for longer. So went through lots and lots of pedals to learn that expensive lesson. But if you know these things up front, you save a lot of money. Great. And thanks, Erin, for putting that link in. Marley, do you want to take this one?
Yes, sorry about that. I was trying to find a resource. You know, as we go through this, sometimes we're learning that sometimes things just aren't big or small enough. And that's why Kaylee and I are, you know, we're doing these calls, but we're also trying to work with the companies and say the market demand is there. We need technical clothing. You know, fat people aren't waterproof. Kaylee rode across Alaska a couple of years ago without a rain jacket, which just isn't acceptable. You know, there's people climbing mountains. We're going bike packing. We need clothing that works for us. Here's a good example. And full disclosure, I am an ambassador for Pearl Izumi, and you know, they don't make half their stuff in my size, which is incredibly frustrating as one of their ambassadors. But it's like, you know, if I wanted to buy this super cute shirt, it doesn't come in my size. Other things, you know, thinking about knee pads or protective gear if you're into mountain biking. Kaylee and I help run a Facebook group called All Bodies on Bikes, and folks will put things in there about like, hey, does anybody know if there's a knee pad brand that will fit this circumference of a leg? And somebody chimed in and was like, I had to make my own or modify my own. And like, those are real safety concerns. One other thing to bring up here, and I would love it if anybody has any resources, we get asked a lot about helmets, especially for people, for Black people with larger hair. And I don't have a good resource for that. So if anybody knows of helmets that fit people with larger hair, would love to know that. But we've also heard from people who are very small that this can also be a problem. So definitely need to make sure we're meeting everybody's needs. Let's go ahead and go to the next one.
Great. We won't spend a lot of time on marketing. When we talk to different brands and companies, we spend a lot more time on marketing. But we did want to talk a little bit about this. We mentioned earlier, you know, who we see in images in a store or online indicates who's invited to shop or to attend an event, or who's invited into the community. And for people in larger bodies, marketing, really for anybody, marketing is not enough, right? We have to do more than just change who's in our marketing. But it helps a lot to start seeing people that look like us and have the products there that serve people in larger bodies' needs. And so Marley's going to talk through quickly a good example, and then we'll have time for questions.
Yeah, so here's a great example of actually my brain is just not on yet today, and I apologize. It's 8 o'clock here right now. But basically a cross product promotion, I guess you could say, that Merrill did with Unlikely Hikers. So if folks are familiar with Unlikely Hikers and Jenny Brusso, they're a group that's similar to what Kaylee and I are doing on the hiking side. And Jenny worked with Merrill basically to design or to redesign one of their existing shoes to make it gender neutral. So they took away the men's and the women's, they widened the footbed, and they just made a couple other tweaks to make it better for people in larger bodies. I believe they made the circumference of the ankle larger, just things in general that people in larger bodies have issues with hiking shoes. And it sold out within like 2 days, I think, and it's become their second best-selling shoe, I think. But I just really love this collaboration. That's the word, this collaboration that Merrill did, and also in all of their marketing. And I think Jenny really had a say in, you know, who was in the photos and what they did. But other brands are starting to pay attention. Gregory Packs, if folks are into backpacking, they just came out with a line of plus size backpacks, which you might not even think about, like, oh yeah, that's a thing we need. But if you think about it, you know, our torsos are bigger, our hips are bigger. Everything has to be adjusted for comfort and safety on the trail. And so there's so much opportunity here. And I would love to see this, you know, if we do this presentation again in a year, of five examples here in the bike world. You know, hey, here's a mountain bike that can hold a 350-pound person with the right shocks, or here's a bike packing bike, or whatever it might be. So cool. Let's go to the next one. All right. So then, what are Kaylee and I doing? You know, this has felt like a total whirlwind since the film has come out, and it really has been. But we've got all sorts of things on the docket, and we are open to additional suggestions if folks are like, hey, I would love for you to do this. So right now we are running biking for bigger people classes. These are via Zoom to, you know, get folks all over the globe involved. But we talk about, you know, how to choose a bike, how to find a bike that's appropriate for you, clothing, like we talked a little bit about earlier. It's similar to this conversation today, but it's really aimed at folks who are in larger bodies and addressing those specific concerns. Obviously, this conversation is on there. We do have a couple of communities that are going on. So we have the Instagram, All Bodies on Bikes, Facebook, which I realize I kind of hate Facebook, but there's one community I really love, and it's the All Bodies on Bikes. And that's not just to be like self-promotional, but it really is like the most positive community I've ever been a part of. People are just like posting their rides and, you know, their successes of somebody saying, hey, I haven't been on a bike in 20 years. And I went for a 3-mile ride with my kid, and it was the best thing ever. So if you need an injection of positivity, really encourage you to join that community. It really is open to everyone. You don't have to be a person in a larger body. And there's also lots of opportunities to give advice. People are looking for routes in all sorts of parts of the world. They're looking for clothing. They're looking for all sorts of things. So you might have experience to lend there. One thing that we have created as part of that, and I'll put that into the chat, is a Fat Bikers resource. And it's a Google Doc. That link is really ugly, but you'll see we've got some tabs on there with additional, it's like crowdsourced brands. We've got bike brands on there, and then we're also crowdsourcing shops that people have had good experiences with, because that can be challenging to walk into a bike shop as a larger person. So.
Great. So we are open to questions with about 10 minutes left in this session, right? And we'll just leave up, this is a kind of a resource guide of different Instagrams and podcasts and groups and books that we follow that give us inspiration and encourage you to look at. So we'll turn it over for chat now.
All right, thank you so much, Marley and Kaylee. You just shared so many incredible resources and so much knowledge in what, half an hour. I'm very impressed. Yeah, like you said, I want to open up to questions now. So please feel free, chat us, unmute yourselves. Kat, I see you have your hand up first. So if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself.
I really just wanted to fangirl for a minute because the video, I'm already going to start crying. I never felt more seen, including Marley, your flower dresses, because that's how I look almost every time I'm on my bike. So just thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to cry now.
I know, me too. I've had like the most emotional week of my life. So thank you, Kat.
Thank you. That's awesome.
There's a woman in the UK who is writing an article about biking and dresses. I should send her your way. Because she was like, I'd always thought about it, but thought I couldn't do it. And then she saw the film similarly and was like, oh my gosh, it's possible. I'm like, yeah, it's great.
And this is a tangential, but so I don't know if we mentioned something that's given me a lot of hope since the film came out is that we've had a lot of opportunities to talk with bike manufacturers, bike clothing brands, retail shops about how to be more inclusive, how to make equipment for people in larger bodies. Like the bike industry is listening, and it's going to take a few years for us to see the physical changes of that because of logistics that Marley knows more about in her day job. But it's amazing that they are listening, that changes are coming. The shops are interested in taking the time to learn about culture shifts and how to be respectful of people in larger bodies in shops. So I saw there was a question about local bike shops that are size inclusive if people have recommendations to put in the chat.
And honestly, on that, it might not even be like, like they're specifically trained, but it's like they're nice to you, or they're welcoming, or they're just not assholes. And unfortunately, like, Kaylee and I are working with brands to, and actually Shimano specifically, to get this information out there and hopefully do like a large scale training for bike shops. And we have had some bike shops actually reach out to us for training. But a lot of it is just personal experience of somebody said, hey, I went to the shop and was able to have a conversation about, getting stronger wheels or getting on a stronger bike. So it's those personal experiences of people who, of a fat friendly shop, basically. Yeah.
Tina asked this great question about how advocates for people in larger bodies can address diet talk. I think it's just a fantastic question. Just like we can show up for people with less power and privilege by calling ahead or speaking up in group settings, I think we can do this, and people in smaller bodies should be doing this when they're around conversations that seem fat phobic or are very focused on diet restricted eating, is to use your privilege as a person in a smaller body to say, that you don't know who's here and what their experiences are, and set that boundary for them so that a person in a larger body doesn't have to put themselves out there and do that work. So really just, even if it's not a boundary for you, just bringing it up in a respectful way that, hey, it might be a boundary for somebody else. So in the future, just beware of who you're talking about these topics with. Marley and I aren't here to say like people shouldn't diet or they can't talk about diet. It's just that it is a sensitive topic, and so I think we can all do work to try and limit how publicly we talk about those types of things.
Yeah, and I don't want to hear about it.
Yeah.
So.
It just isn't that interesting.
Frankly.
Any other questions?
And if there's something that you want to ask but don't feel comfortable about, reach out to, we'll put our contact into the chat. We had it on the first slide. We should have it on this slide too. But feel free to send us emails or Instagram messages. We're around. So yeah. And if anybody has trips out to Seattle or Oregon this summer or wants to, let us know.
Yeah, Sarah.
Hi, also have to fangirl for a little bit. Thank you so much for spending your morning with us. After watching the documentary, came away from just like this amazing feel-good place. Can you guys give us a little bit of a behind the scenes of how the documentary was filmed, and a little inside scoop of some of the good things that have come out of it too? You're just creating this like amazing, fuzzy, feel-good feeling. So let's continue that.
Sure. Yeah, so long story short, Kaylee and I were doing this work, creating community, et cetera, et cetera. Kaylee went to college with the director who was like, hey, let's make a film. He approached Shimano over Instagram, like slid into their DMs and got funding. And then like we basically spent all of spring last year planning this, and it was like, crap, COVID is like raging. How are we going to do this? And so we tried to be as safe as possible. And the film crew, which was, and Kaylee, step in at any point, it was 3 guys, 2 from Utah, and Zeppelin is kind of nomadic. We met up at Kaylee's house, basically in Corvallis. And they followed us in a creepy white van for 60 miles. Uh,
Yeah, and they, something you don't see in the film is that they are three very extreme athletes. They are tall, thin, white men. And we were pretty concerned about that leading up to the filming of how they would tell our story and how they would treat us in the process. And it was amazing. I think we all learned a lot, and at least they say they learned a lot, and it was evident by the way they acted. They just did, and you can see in the film, like a wonderful job giving us a platform to tell our story. And they took our suggestions. We were really part of the editing process of the film and deciding how the story got told. So it was about a week of filming and then many months of editing, and then many more months of just like sitting on the finished product, which was kind of funny, before it came out.
Yeah, one really funny story is like we had a release date, and then a week before, or maybe 3 days before, we got a call from our like rep at Shimano, who was like, "Hey, we have to delay the film because it's our 100th anniversary. We forgot." Like, you've had 100 years to plan for this. Like, how did you? So for me, it was like really enlightening as like the behind the scenes of how all these things happen. It's like, it's real people have jobs, like, and things get messed up. But the whole process was really, really wonderful. We worked with Shimano's like marketing team and their social media team to be like, hey, like if any trolls come into the comments, like this is what's okay to say, this is what's not okay. But we didn't really even have any of that. It was wild. I don't know how we found this like amazing little corner of the internet, but
it is 8:14, or I guess 11:14 there. So we'll stop talking and pass it back to Sarah.
yeah, thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much for joining us today.